Hey everybody, it's the fifth of our seminars on radical theology. This is our wrap-up seminar, and we're really lucky to have Jack Caputo and Peter Rollins with us today. And if you've been following along, we began this seminar with Jack from home, and then there was an interlude with Pete and I in Paris, and now we're all spread all over. So I'm in London, Jack's in his study, coming back again, and Pete's in Belfast, and you are wherever you are. So what we're going to do is Jack's going to lead off, probably talk for about, I don't know, 12 minutes or so, and then Pete's going to follow and talk about 12 minutes or so, and then we'll see. I'll say a little something, and then we'll open up for questions. We're going to be here for about an hour or so, so it's a tight time, but thanks for showing up. And why don't you take us away, Jack? And if
Okay, thank you
everybody
very
can
much.
make sure everybody's muted so we don't get weird noises on the tape.
Okay, I could go on for an hour or so with all the things that my head has been filled with in the last few days that we've been meeting. But let me try to condense this in 12 minutes. And I've got my watch in front of me. Uh, let's go back to the schema that we've been using, which I think is perfectly good, and that is to think of radical theology in terms of theism, atheism, radical theology. So the radical theology is the third thing. Now, normally, I mean, I'm fine with that schema, and I'm going to work with it right now. Normally, when I present radical theology, I have a slightly different genealogy. I move from classical theism to panentheism, in which case which is the overcoming of classical theism, the overcoming of the supreme being. Um, in which case I invoke Tillich. So Tillich is my bridge figure, my transitional figure to radical theology. In the Anglo-American tradition, you can also use Whitehead and get pretty much the same result. And then from theism, classical theism to panentheism to radical theology, where radical theology is post-metaphysical, post-ontological, whereas both Tillich and Whitehead are quite thick with what we call ontotheology or metaphysical theology. But it's perfectly fine to do it the way that we've got it set up in the seminar. In which case, what I would argue would look like this, and it'll overlap with some of the things that Pete has and Barry have been saying, and also slightly different. Um, Theism is the theology of the supreme being. Atheism says the supreme being doesn't exist. Theism speaks of God in terms of the ens realissimum. Atheism says that it's a fiction or an hallucination. Theism is a theory of belief. Atheism is a theory of disbelief. Theism importantly turns on some form of supernaturalism. That is to say, it thinks that the authority for what it has to say is actually divine. It's been communicated or revealed in some way or another to human beings who are no longer speaking in their own name, but in the name of God who has passed this along to him. Atheism is a naturalistic critique of that. It simply says, Jesus didn't walk on water; he was walking on big stones, and from a distance, it looked like he walked on water. So naturalism is just simply is the debunking of that. Now, both of those positions are, from the point of view of what I think radical theology is, both of them are defective. Classical theism is, I think, a mystification. I think it is it's a personification of something. Something's going on there, but it has personified it. It's turned it into a supreme being who is infinitely smarter than us, infinitely more powerful than us, and infinitely better than us. So I think it has literalized and reified something. I think it's important, but it's distorted it in just that way. Atheism, or let's just say the death of God, um, is um, is defective in the opposite direction. That is, it's reductionistic. It's the philosophy of religion is nothing more than. So it reduces religion to some kind of naturalistic phenomenon. So the great masters of suspicion, Marx and Freud and Nietzsche, for Marx, religion is nothing more than an instrument of the oppression of the poor. There's something to that. I'm not saying there's not. It's nothing more than an opiate that makes them satisfied with their poverty. In Freud, um, religion is a desire for your mommy interdicted by the nom du père. It's nothing more than that. It's reduced to that. In Nietzsche, it's nothing more than the resentment of the weak against the strong. Now, interestingly, which is certainly too often. I mean, all these things are true, and they're too often true of religion. Nietzsche actually is the most interesting of the three because Nietzsche also plants the seeds of the deconstruction of that whole schema, because it's the schema of the master discourse. It's replaced the old God with a new God, namely a master voice that can say that religion is nothing more than this and nothing more than that. Nietzsche calls that the ascetic ideal. He says there is no master discourse. And he says, we won't be rid of God until we get rid of grammar. Yeah. Nietzsche was a brilliant philologist. He had nothing against grammar. What he meant was we won't get rid of God until we get rid of master discourses. Right? We won't be rid of God until basically until we're rid of reductionistic discourse. He called it the ascetic ideal. And in Derrida, you have the same kind of criticism of this kind of discourse, in which he says of the death of God that nothing in deconstruction, nothing is really dead. The dead have a way of wielding their own powers in their own way. The dead have a way of haunting us, and so the death of God for Derrida would result in a specter, a spectrality that continues to disturb us. Now, from my point of view, the way to treat both theism and theism is in terms of what Husserl called a transcendental reduction or a transcendental epoche. That is to say, a simple bracketing of the belief of theism, a bracketing of the disbelief of theism, a suspension on the one hand of supernaturalism and the suspension on the other hand of naturalistic reduction, a reduction of the supernatural signified and a reduction of the transcendental or rationalist super signified. That would be the methodological key or entry to or doorway into radical theology. Neither supernatural revelation nor illusion nor hallucination. So what's left once those reductions are put in place? What's left is radical theology. What's left is what Hegel called a Vorstellung, an imaginative figuration. He said religion, he placed religion in the middle, as you know, in the middle of the three spheres of absolute spirit: philosophy, religion, art. Philosophy at the top, religion at the bottom. Religion, or art at the bottom. Religion is more sensuous than philosophy. Why? Because it tells stories and narratives and it sings hymns and it has liturgies and it's visceral and a visceral component that's foreign to philosophy. But it's more conceptual than art. Why? Because it's talking about about matters of ultimate concern. It's talking about good and evil. It's talking about life and death, being and non-being, the origin of things, the meaning of things. So it's more conceptual than art. What's left? What's left is what Tilly calls a symbol. A symbol is two things to remember about a symbol. One, a symbol, if you know what a symbol is, you'll never say it's only a symbol. Two, if you know what a symbol is, you'll never confuse a symbol with what it's a symbol of. What's it a symbol of? The ground of being, the unconditional. What's left after these transcendental reductions? What Derrida calls an event, and now we're getting close to the post-metaphysical, post-theological position, post-metaphysical position that I'm after. What's left is the event. What's the event? The event is what is going on in that name. The name is not the name of an entity or even the ground of entities. It's the name of a call, of a promise, of a recollection. It's a name of a call which is calling us and to what's ahead, what's to come, and it's recalling us to and invoking a mourning for a past that was never present. It's the event is the promise and the memory of what is going on in that name. And so it has a spectral quality. The name is never identical with itself. The thing it's talking about is not identical with itself. It is inwardly disturbed by promise and memory. It's what's happening, what's going on inside that event. And that for him is possibility of what he calls the possibility of the impossible. That's what I'm calling weak theology. That's why I was very happy to see Barry bring up the name of Michel de Guy and his notion of weak, the weakness of faith, a man of weak faith, what I call oligopistology. What's left is a weak theology, a theology of the event, a theology of the insistence of God. God does not exist, God insists. What's left is a poem or a theopoem, such that the name of God is the name of a theopoetic effect. It's a placeholder for the possibility of the impossible. It's a substitutable, undecidable place where we give name to the possibility of the impossible, which is the possibility of keeping the future open. And then the last thing I'll say, and I still got 2 minutes, is that leads me to take a very different approach to desire, to what Pete does. There's a lot of overlapping between what Pete and I are saying, but I have a very different attitude about desire. But think of it this way: the universe is running down, right? The sun is flaring, is burning up, using up its own fuel, is burning out. In 500 million years or a billion years from now, it will flare up. The Earth will be toast. The sun will shrink into a white dwarf, and the same thing's happening to all the other stars in the universe. The whole universe is expanding into entropic oblivion. The universe is running down. It's governed by the law of entropy. What is life? Life is neg-entropic. It's the opposite of that. Life isn't running down. Life is in evolution. The universe is in devolution. Life is in evolution. Life is building up. It's becoming more and more and more complex. It's on the verge of detaching itself from its biological foundations right now. It's a process of upbuilding. It's exactly the opposite of the universe's tendency. The universe, life and the universe are going like that. What is desire? For me, desire is the energy of life. It's a productive, creative energy. It's it's the very soul of human existence. It's when I was in the religious life, we were doing our conferences on the 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and one of the brothers raised their hand and they said, "Brother Director, when will temptations against the vow of chastity cease?" And Brother Director said, "15 minutes after you're dead," which is a great line. It's when desire stops, the only thing to do is call the undertaker. Desire is the very energy of life. It's a product of our creative imagination, our productive imagination, our apophatic imagination. We are beings of the desire. And what do we desire? When we desire this, we desire that. What is our desire beyond desire? What do I truly desire? I don't know. I don't know. I desire something for which I have no name. I am turned towards a future which I cannot see coming, which Heidegger and Derrida both call the open. The open. The name of God is a placeholder for a posture of radical openness towards the coming of what I cannot see coming. It is what Derrida calls the passion of non-knowing. The passion of non-knowing. So it's a different way of looking about desire. So, and that's my 12 minutes. Did it. I
Well,
got it done in 12 minutes.
Well, there was nothing in that, Jack. I don't know. Just 12 minutes of our time there. I don't know what to say. Anyway, that was great. Thank you so much. So, I'll just go right over to you, Pete, and you can do your whatever you're going to do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And that was wonderful. This is a big deal to me because I'll say a little bit more about well, I mean, I basically got into radical theology because of Jack. And I remember very clearly when it happened. I was at Queen's University. I was doing my PhD and I was in a bookshop and I came across On Religion, a little book that Jack wrote, and it started off with it's a really a reflection on a simple line from Augustine from Book 10 of the Confessions. What do I love when I love my God? And I'm going to come back to that in a second, but I do want to start with a story. I was just Jack was talking, I was thinking about it. Story about my friend Seamus, obviously, and it's a Saturday night, and he's sitting with his wife, and his wife says, "You know, you never go out with that guy Willie anymore. He was your best mate. He used to always go for drinks on Saturday night, and you would come back, and you're always in great form. You know, you always loved hanging out with them. Like, why don't you do that anymore?" And Seamus looks at her and just goes, "Well, listen, I tell you what, would you want to hang out with someone who never bought around, never put his hand in his pocket, just talked about himself all the time and was not interested in anything that was going on in your life?" And his wife goes, "Oh, yeah, no, I wouldn't want that either." And he says, "Well, truth is," he says, "turns out Willie feels the same way." Right now, that's how I feel when I'm talking about Jack. Is if we disagree, it's because I'm in the wrong, not him. So I'm going to kind of try to kind of say a little bit about what the differences are, but very much from a place of saying, if we disagree, it's because it's because of me, and that's not false modesty. Jack has been incredibly influential in my life and getting me into radical theology. So, coming back to that book on religion, it starts off with that question: "What do I love when I love my God?" And it really, for me, expresses this idea that Augustine says, "There's no doubt I love. There's no doubt I love God. I have this signifier God I love." But what is it that I love when I love my God, or truth, or beauty, or justice, or democracy, or hospitality? What do I love? And then in the book, it kind of, and I'll be interested to see if I'm going to try and sum up some of Jack's work in 3 minutes. So it's going to be, it's going to be crude. But the religious spirit is a spirit of openness to a future, to a promise, that there's something in language, in these words like truth and God and justice and democracy, that we never nail it down. There is a call and a promise. And, Jack talks about the undeconstructible. There's something happening in these signifiers that we cannot grasp, but that calls us forth. And Jack was talking about desire and this desire. So in some respects, the religious spirit is at its best a sensitivity to this openness to the future, to new possibilities. And that idea, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, is the idea is if you meet democracy and think you have it, if you think you have justice, if you think you have God, if you think you know hospitality, kill it, because you don't. There is something that is constantly open. And I love that kind of approach. So that brought me on this journey, and it's quite similar to Paul Tillich in many ways. So Paul Tillich has this idea, and in my search for absolutes, he talks about how the one who loves truth argues about truth all the time, but kind of in the name of truth. The artist never captures beauty, but they are, in a sense, caught up in beauty. In every failure, there is a type of success. The lawyer, because I think he was actually talking to the law department, I think, with these lectures in my search for absolutes. He says, if you're desiring justice, you never nail it. The law, and Derrida uses that example, you never nail it, but you're kind of always, by writing laws, inspired by a justice that is always to come. And then, of course, that's a move from religious experience as some sort of saturation or short circuiting that some people have and maybe some people don't, or maybe everybody has at some moment in their life, right? But it kind of turns to something much more universal, which says that the religious experience is in a sense an experience of a lack of something you don't have, a democracy to come, a justice to come, a hospitality to come. And it's very close to that idea of Paul Tillich's ultimate concern. And yet what Caputo does, Jack does, is, there's a book where he wrote about, and he talked about it there with onto theology. There's still too much metaphysics in someone like Tillich, and actually we could talk about the groundless ground of being, right? So in my reading of Jack's work, there is this sense in which even it's not Kantian that there is a something out there that we can't even name. Forget about that. Forget about all of that. Be sensitive to this dimension of desire and this dimension of language, and what it does. So where do I potentially differ from that? I have been largely seduced, I reckon, back into some sort of metaphysics, because what I'm interested in is this idea that this unspeakable dimension, this undeconstructible dimension, this insistence, this event, not entity, as Jack would say, or this insistence, not existence, which is, again, all these beautiful turns of phrase that Jack uses, that insistence and that event, I kind of come around to saying that is something substantive. It's a type of object. It's not just in language. It's in mathematics. It's in biology. It's in physics. There's an asymmetry. There's a non-coincidence of things with themselves that isn't just a kind of a subjective linguistic experience, but actually we can talk about this substantively, that we can say there is a truth, a reality that is uncomputable, that cannot be proved, that insists, and the name of that, real, can be God. And so I'm really interested in, I want to give Jack as much time to respond to this, because I'm genuinely going like critique this or see if I've got this right or wrong. But what I think is the difference is Jack would say that this is, too metaphysical, too kind of going back to a type of ontotheology, an attempt to see behind the curtain. But I'm very interested in this idea of radical theology as naming God, not as a substance, not as a reality, not as something that doesn't exist, but as an inexistent thing, as a signifier, as a name for a type of object, a type of non-object, a type of eternal reality, and not just, we don't necessarily have to suspend our judgments, but we can actually kind of like talk about this in a substantive way. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to you, Barry. But yeah, very interested in Jack responding.
Yeah, well, what I think I'll do, because I don't think you need actually one more talking head to get in here, and I've had the privilege of doing a number of seminars on radical theology here at GCAS, and I think it's I'd like to hear as well. And I'll just say really quickly, Jack is also the person who, for me, got me into radical theology. I found Vatimo, and through Vatimo, I found Jack, and I read The Weakness of God, and it made my knees go weak in the best possible way. But I don't know. Do you want to respond to that, Jack? I thought it'd be interesting to see what you think about, because I've heard you. I think I heard you say not that long ago something about a shift in your view of, I don't know if it was the transcendent or the metaphysics, I'm not sure, but do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, what Peter's bringing up is something I've been going back and forth with Catherine Keller about, because Catherine comes to very much same conclusions we're coming to, but through Whitehead, who of course was a mathematician and a scientist and a quantum theorist before he was a philosopher. And the process branch of radical theology is quite sympathetic and congenial to science. And the shift in my own thinking has been, I mean, I've been affected by what she's been arguing with me, and I think that's true. I think that one of the limitations of continental philosophy has been to be too innocent of science. So consequently, I've in Specters of God, I spell out at some length the sense in which I think we need to include some kind of realist or metaphysical or objectivist principle, and which I never meant to deny, and I never meant to suggest anything. Like I spent a good deal of my time trying to defend Derrida against the charges that it's subjectivism or linguisticism. I mean, what I think we're talking about is that in which we live and move and have our being, that which has us before we have it, the unencompassable, unfreethinkable, Schelling's word. Schelling's objection to Tillich, or to Hegel, was the unfreethinkability of things, that the logos can't get its head around being, because being has this kind of irreducible primordiality. It's the prius. The prius is not thinking, the prius is being. So what I'm trying to do is work this out as a theory of theopoetics, and I'm going back to phenomenology, because phenomenology has this principle of intentionality, that whatever it is that's going on in us, it's responsive to something in the world. It's our actions are reactions to a prior input, a more primordial world, which is, as I said, has us before we have it. So what I'm talking about is is not simply a linguistic possibility or a subjective attitude. It has to do with our being in the world, our relationship to the world, our factical being in the world. And so the way I like to, when I get down to looking for basic terms, one of my favorite ones is the notion of the open, the unforeseeable, the thing that is, we can't see it coming. It's not up to us to consent to it. It has us before we have it. So there is I mean, a good deal of continental philosophy in the late 20th century was about the other, right? The other of language, the alterity. Levinas's critique of Husserl was the alterity of the other person. Not the other person is not just simply a kind of clone or sympathetic simile of the ego. It's an alterity that's coming at us. So the notion of the event in there is no notion of the incoming of the event is it's coming in at us. It's, in military language, incoming means duck, right? And that's how I think of the event. We're trying to explain our radical exposure to the world, the factical, conditioned, limited exposure to a world that overwhelms us. It has an overwhelming power for us. So no, I didn't mean to suggest something subjective.
Yeah,
I meant what you call intentionality in phenomenology.
Yeah. Well, what do you think of then? So I kind of then am very influenced by this idea that our first experience of this unknowing dimension, this otherness, is with the desire of, say, our primary caregivers, is the question of what does the other want of me? So you have the presence and absence, say, of the mother. They leave and they come back, and the Fort Da game, this the child's maybe playing with presence and absence. But then after that, they encounter a much more radical present absence, which is the presence of a desire that is an enigma. You know, what makes me desirable? You know, who am I to the other, et cetera, et cetera. And so our kind of first encounter with this question and this unknowability is in our encounter with the other. And, you know, then realizing that there is no answer to that question, that the other is not just a mystery to us, but a mystery to themselves. And so this mystery is not so much just a kind of an openness to the future, but it's actually an encounter with the mystery that dwells among us in the presence of the other. I mean, is that do you use a different framework, or is that a
Yeah, I mean, I think that on that point, I'm a Hegelian, not a Kantian. I think the ego is a late product. I think it's
Mhm.
we are born into, if we're lucky, into a supportive community, into a supportive family, and a community around it, which upon which we're completely dependent, and which we are by which we're nourished. And then slowly, by a process of evolution and growth and nurturing, we grow into a certain kind of self-identity, but we're never identical with ourselves. And
Yeah.
our relationships with others is a relationship of um, would be a relationship of trust and support, and but always recognizing the mystery of the other, that the
Yeah.
other, that I cannot think the other's thoughts. And I don't even want to be able to. We don't want our thoughts to be broadcast. So yeah, we are communal beings through and through. It's a Sittlichkeit, what Hegel calls Sittlichkeit. It's a moral community, and if it's not strong and nourishing, our lives will be wrecked.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And it's that,
I
yeah.
think all that.
Oh, good.
They'll be very difficult anyway if they're not wrecked.
Yeah.
Uh,
Because from that perspective, for me, is if in that caring community, almost like that Freudian notion that trauma is kind of an encounter. Like, well, I suppose for me, I make a distinction, you know, between the mystical religious experience, which is like Jean-Luc Marion's saturated phenomenon, we're overwhelmed, and a kind of religious experience in which we encounter not a saturation and a short circuiting, but rather we experience this openness, this profound wound of unknowing. And I think those are, and I think that actually coincides with the move from Freud's seduction theory, where trauma is some event that happens to us that we can't conceptualize, can't put into the symbolic, to where he went towards, which is what makes something traumatic is actually the question of why the other person is doing this. What enjoyment are they getting from this? That actually the traumatic core is the core of a question. And so for me, that's the interesting thing about religion. And I'll give one example for the Zizek uses, I think is very good about the unconscious, but he says he went to see a movie. The movie was based on a book. The movie wasn't that good. So he thought, I'll go and read the book and see what the film was missing. And then he read the book and he realized the book was even worse than the film. And so the movie and the book generated a third, which was a non-existent manuscript that was perfect, right? So the failure of the film and the failure of the book generate a third, and that third does not exist, but it insists. And that for me is kind of objet putia. That's the kind of like that's what I mean. So that's for me, that's how desire functions in a way. It's weirdly not so much it's very, very oriented to the failures that happen in our world that shape then a fantasy of a future. So that's how I think of desire and maybe how desire works. Um in the same way that the kind of the question of the other and what does the other want from me shapes my desire.
Yeah, yeah. Levinas will sometimes use the word trauma for the experience of the other, but he means it in the sense of a shock,
Mhm.
which breaks open the ecological prison and
Yep.
exposes us and makes us vulnerable. And so he means a kind of non-pathological trauma,
Yep.
and it's not it's not the kind of trauma where you need a doctor and you need
Yes.
it's a wound, but it's not the kind of wound which needs medical attention.
Mhm.
It's phenomenological trauma,
Yep.
and I think that's what generally goes under the name of the other in the phenomenology of the other, or the deconstructionist concept of the other. And that trauma, that constant disequilibrium in life is uh, essential. It's essential.
Mhm.
What Schelling's critique of Hegel was not that there's no such thing as reason or logos, but that it's ecstatic, he said. Ecstatic. That is to say, it's exposed, it's broken into by something that it can't get its head around, which is the primordiality of being itself. The reason being cannot be saturated by reason. Is his argument against Schelling, against Hegel, and so I think that kind of ecstasis, disequilibrium. I like to speak of an optimal disequilibrium, because a total disequilibrium would just simply be chaos and real trauma and psychosis. But an optimal disequilibrium, a relative stability, which means a relative instability, and an exposure to the unforeseeable in the other person. And you can be married to someone for 56 years and you don't know what they're going to say next sometimes.
Yeah.
That's not a bad thing. That's part of the mystery of existence and the mystery of our relationships. So
Well,
I
then
don't
would
I
you?
don't like the language of trauma because it sounds like there's something wrong with us. But I don't like the language of original sin, by the way, because it
Yeah.
sounds like there's something wrong with us. I don't think we are deeply fucked. I think we are in a limited factical historical condition situation, and that's the condition of possibility of movement and kinesis of life, of vitality, of the temporality.
Yeah. Oh, very quickly, and then sorry. Oh, Barry, jump in.
I was just gonna say, just respond to this, and then we'll open up to questions if that's all right with you.
Okay, absolutely. Oh yeah. So yeah, no, I have an enjoyment of words that are like trauma, original sin, and so I'm going to use another one that is not popular, which I quite like, which is hysteria. Is that we like I kind of like the idea that I'm trying to, in a book that I'm writing at the moment, talk about that hysteria. If in one sense you think of hysteria as a person who experiences themselves as not at one with themselves, the hysteric goes, do I love this person? Do I not love this person? Am I an imposter? I'm a teacher, but am I really a teacher? The question of division. The idea, I'm interested in the idea of an hysterical God, that the hysteria is within everything, including the divine. So God is not unknown. God is unknowing, that there is a spontaneity and asymmetry within the absolute itself or within reality itself. And I kind of just said, is that a kind of language that you like or dislike, or would critique or would appropriate? Or yeah, what's your feeling on that? So is yeah, that's
The sound of it is reductionistic to me.
mm,
It sounds like there's some master discourse into which things get translated, and then once they're translated, then you run this routine on them, and there's a method, and there's a pseudo Wissenschaft which thinks it can deal with this thing. And I don't. I'm wary of master discourses.
yeah.
I'm wary of some language into which everything can be translated.
Mm,
And um, you, I think that's what happens in fundamentalism, and I think it's what happens in any of the master discourses, which includes science and which includes science itself. So, but anyway, we
Yeah.
want
Okay.
to open this up to some
I,
questions.
I think I've worked out our next seminar between the three of us, which I think is going to be, I'm just telling you what we're going to be doing, whether you like it or not now, is I think we're going to take the issues that we are talking about, like desire, metaphysics, original sin. We're going to take 4 specific contexts and find a way to spend an hour or so talking about each of them. I think that would be a really interesting way of digging deeper into those. What do you reckon?
Well, I love it. Yeah.
All right, well then we'll work that out. Anyway, we don't have too much time for questions, so here's what I'll ask. Please ask a question, not give an opinion, but to try and break down as simple a question as you can to these incredibly complex ideas, perhaps, or these notions. So we've got 3 people that I can see already. So I'll start with, and I've got somebody sent me 10 questions in an email. I'll try and do honor and get to one of those, but I'll go with Davida, then Sawyer, then Ethan, then Chris. So as quick as you can, Davida, and you might have to you have to unmute yourself probably.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Good to see you, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you. Good to see you too. This is wonderful. Thank you for this. Yeah. Like, do you think I was really hit by what Peter was saying about the otherness of the other, no, the primordial trauma of not being able to answer to the question, what the fuck you want from me? And I think in the book of Zupančič, What is Sex, that it's the name of sexuality in a way. Sexuality is where natural laws cease to regulate themselves. That's what sexuality is. It's a primordial repression. My only question is, can we see that as the opening that Jack was talking about? Like when you arrive to that level of analysis, which is the primordial unconscious in a way, it's not the attachments like Jungian unconscious. It's a more original unconscious. And like, but my question is, can we see that as inside language, not outside language? Is it like actually the condition for language itself? We have language because we have that lack. So it's an engine for, so Agamben would call being in language, that dimension. He makes this, and I finish really quickly. He makes this like very interesting metaphor of we are like a fly inside a glass cup, and the fly keeps hitting the cup and can't see the glass because he can see the world through the glass, but he always hit the glass. So basically, it's impossible for us to get out of language. The only thing we can get it is to reach that glass, and maybe that is what Freud calls death drive. So my point is to be short, like, can we really go out of language? You know, isn't it this dimension we are talking being, which is also the Zizek is talking about the virtual of the real. It doesn't exist, but is it like, inside language, that dimension, that openness?
Thank you. I can very, very shortly say, I think you've articulated that very well. So I actually don't have much to contribute. I think you're right. I think the real is within language, but I'll offer Jack if he wants to respond a little bit more.
Well, the real is accessed by language, and language is the point of language is to keep language as a contingent, relatively stable, and therefore relatively unstable and endlessly revisable process, so that words don't have meanings, they have histories, and they have futures, and they have memories. And it's not a question of getting inside or outside of language. If you want to get outside of language, you could just, there are beings who are outside of language. Just look out your window at the nearest tree. Language is not a trap. If that were the case, then learning two languages would be even more of a prison than only knowing one. Language is intentional. It's a relationship to the world. It is heliotropic. It's like the sun hits the flower and the flower turns to the sun, or the world hits us and we turn towards the world and give word to it. It's not a glass that you bounce up against. It's a glass that it's not a glass at all. It's a relationship to the world.
So the word is outside language for you, Jack.
Language is a relationship between whatever you want to call the subject and the world. It's the world is one end of it. Language is the other end of it. Words propel us into the world.
I don't agree.
Being toward the world. Sein zu Welt.
All right. Thanks, David. I know we could spend the next 20 minutes on that subject, but I'm sorry. I just want to get everybody's question in. Please. So Sawyer, you're up.
Thank you. And thank you both for thanks. Yeah, this has been a really great seminar. So it's not a simple question, but it's a quick one. What do you think the stakes are for both Jack and Peter? What are the stakes of desire as a productive force opposed to desire as lack? Like, what are the stakes here for the future, for community, for society? This kind of
And actually, something I was going to say about desire as well, because Jack was saying about entropy and desire, like the difficulty, and I don't know if I'd be able to do it right now, definitely not with the time constraint, but what I always see with what Freud is trying to do is trying to see how does desire, how does this excess, how does jouissance actually arise out of entropy? So, these are opposites, but actually, they have to tie together. Like potentially entropy is the truth of the universe, as Jack was saying, everything is entropic. So then how does jouissance, how does this excessive dimension arise out of that? And I think Freud, tries to answer that, and then Lacan kind of brings it further, which, in one sense, pleasure is a way of trying to get homeostasis. So we get pleasure by sitting by the beach and reducing our excitation and et cetera, et cetera. So, but then, what is this excess that gets enjoyment not out of homeostasis, but gets enjoyment out of this excess? So yeah, I think it's very important to see if we can, how we connect that, how we get jouissance out of entropy, which I think is what Death Drive is about. But what are the stakes? Jack, do you have any thoughts on that? And
yeah, the stakes of my approach to desire is to maintain the dynamics of creativity, the dynamics of reinventability, the process, openness, and breaking up things that tend to sediment and crust over and become dogmatic. So I want to think of desire in terms of a creative but also apophatic imagination. So I'm thinking of non-dogmatic, non-doctrinal, non-formalizable, non-programmable processes.
And so, yeah, on that, because the other day in this seminar, I made that distinction between demand, desire, and drive, which are all very interconnected, but at a very superficial level. Demand is for an object, desire is for the lost object, drive is for loss itself, in a nutshell, right? So desire, I completely agree with Jack on. Like, desire, I think, is the thing of creativity, constant openness. Also, this is never that. The object that you get never fully satisfies. There's a metaphorical dimension, et cetera, et cetera. The interesting thing I have is drive. And I'm trying to do a religion of drive, which is that we directly enjoy loss. We directly can enjoy dissatisfaction. And that's slightly different, I think, than desire, which is always open to the future, reinventing, rethinking. And drive is where we, in good and bad ways, directly enjoy dissatisfaction. And in capitalism, it's great at that. It's great at it. And it's like we actually, the product, it's not that products don't give us something. I would argue, Todd McGowan would argue that that the product does give you something. It gives you dissatisfaction. That's why we're so addicted, is like the product actually, by not giving you what you want, is giving you what you want, because there's a part of us that desires desire itself, that desires a type of dissatisfaction. So I'm interested in and I think there's a political dimension to that, which is not just desire for openness to the future, but what is the place of drive, which is a direct embrace of dissatisfaction itself? And maybe I make too much of a distinction between those two, but I just threw that out.
Great, mate. Thank you. Points to ponder, Sawyer. Okay, Ethan, you're up. We got 2 questions after you, so
yeah, so I'll definitely be quick. Hi, great to see everyone also that we met in Paris too.
Yes, it's great to meet you.
Yeah. Okay, this question is particularly for John Caputo, since you are kind of like the architect of radical or contemporary radical theology. I'll just be blunt. My criticism comes out of love. Why? So if I understand, radical theology is trying to emphasize this kind of unknowing of God, right? That classical theism and classical atheism kind of just brush under the rug too quickly, and also the weakness of God, right? Now that I'm reading Marx for the first, I'm like a third through Capital. It's pretty good. My simple question is why do we need what does radical theology give that, Marx and Freud and its, contemporary revisions? What do we need? What does radical theology offer that, that communism and psychoanalysis already try to uncover? The alienation of, the labor production, or also just that kind of profound sense of, dissatisfaction that arises from the unconscious. What does radical theology bring that kind of make as like a necessary supplement, if that makes sense? Thank you.
Well, for one thing, both those figures are deeply indebted to the religious traditions that they've inherited, right? I mean, Marx comes from a long line of rabbis, and he's inherited the prophetic tradition of justice, that justice flow like water across the land. So you've got a certain secularization of religious themes, of theological themes going on there. What radical theology is in part a strategic operation which is trying to disturb religion from within. That's why I told Barry that I was sorry that he left the priesthood, because I thought he was in an excellent position to, as he put it, push against the walls from inside. Radical theology is in part a strategic operation to disturb religious dogmatism and the danger of religious nationalism and religious violence. So, and it operates in a way that is sensitive to the discourse of religion. Simply leveling a modernist critique of religion from the outside will do no good. One needs to inhabit religion from within and expose its roots, because its roots are quite profound and quite important. But but to disturb it from within, so it is in part a strategic operation, and secondly, it's radical theology is a way of articulating, of forming, of figuring motifs that have a distinctively religious structure, like the structure of prayer. I think the notion of prayer is quite profound, and it's not merely petitionary prayer. It's a deep contact with reality. So there are resources within this particular kind of discourse that gets shrunk down and reduced by the master discourse of economic necessities and the laws of dialectical materialism, which are not laws at all, and the master discourse of psychoanalysis, where everything gets this. I mean, I grew up in scholasticism, Roman Catholic scholasticism. Roman Catholic scholasticism had about 300 words, basic words: matter, form, privation, substance. And matter what question you had, doesn't matter what the question is, we could answer it. And we had 300 words and we could answer it with one of those 300 words or some combination of them. And that's exactly what psychoanalysis sounds like to me.
I know. No, that's very true. Can I say one thing on this? Because I think this is the difference between me and yeah, I actually did my degree in scholastic philosophy, funnily enough, back in the day.
Right.
One of the differences between me and Jack, and again, I think Jack might be right on this, but I'm still staking myself on it, is, there's a sense in which radical theology haunts confessional theology. So radical theology, I think he has said in the past anyway, is not so much a thing, another institution, but what haunts the institutions, keeps it open to the future, etc.
Right.
And I love that.
Right.
Yeah. Brilliant. So I love that, and I see the amen. This is the additional bit which you're not going to love. Is I go like, yes, that's the eternal and that's the true, but I'm also interested in also creating an institution in which there is, in which the signifier God is understood not as substantive reality, but as a type of radical unknowing or spontaneity or asymmetry within the world. And that weirdly is the Protestant part of me, which wants to create a new institution. However, that new institution still has to be haunted. But I think Jack would stop short of this second one and say you don't necessarily need to do the second one. Anyway, that's that. I'm trying to find the differences between Jack and I.
Radical theology is a parasite. It's parasitic upon. It doesn't have a body of doctrines. It doesn't have an institution. It doesn't take up collections. It doesn't have any seminaries. It doesn't have, as Kierkegaard says, it doesn't have any hearses. It is a alternate form of discourse which disturbs from within the existing traditions. Radical means the radicalization of something. So there's no such thing as radical theology in the abstract. There is the radicalization of the Muslim tradition or the Christian tradition or the Hebraic tradition or whatever tradition. It doesn't, it's not a, if there are 10 religions in the room, radical theology isn't the 11th.
Yes,
it's the
I love that, but
yeah, any one of them from within.
And in one sense, yes, that's it. Because I'm kind of going like, I'm going like, no, but there you can make an institution, which is bad. But the reason why I'm saying that is going like, when something's haunted enough, I think that it does just historically eventually create a qualitatively different type of church, which still has to be haunted and still openness to the eternal future. But there are different historical, instantiations. So yeah, but that's the difference. Is again, I'm going like, but is there not a space for a kind of a post-theistic institution which doesn't exist yet? Anyway, that yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think that radical theology, as well as haunting and digging down into those institutions, also can dig down and haunt the world.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I love that. But like Jack's this like creativity haunts everything. Yeah,
but my point to you, Pete, is that that's where I think your notion comes along and adds the other dimension. Is that in a world where there's a diffusion of religion or a sort of post-death of God world, I think there is space for, I don't know if I'd call it an institution, but a thing that can be haunted again by its own hauntings. But anyway, there are 3 questions here online, so I'm not going to take any more online apart from these 3, and then I'm just going to read one from the 10 that came in an email, which will be slightly tangential because it was before our conversation here today. So Chris, you're up, and then it's Ken, and then it's Bill.
Okay, thanks to all of you. This is addressed to Jack rather than the other 2 who I can get at on other occasions. Jack, you mentioned tangentially Whitehead and also bracketing out ontology. It struck me that Whitehead was keen on saying that he was advancing a speculative ontology. What would you say to the idea that it's an ontology to come always deferred in the same way as say justice or the like? Thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly my position. I didn't say that. I said that in my conversations with Catherine Cower, I've come around to reformulating what I want to say, and the notion of an ontology to come, a speculative ontology to come, tentative, provisional, revisable, subject to the newest information coming in from the Webb telescope. All of that is part of what I mean by openness to the future. And I instead of using the word metaphysics, I tend to use the word ontology. But yes, an ontology, our openness to what's ahead, particularly in AI, in the case of human experience, all of that is part of my thinking. Yeah, and so the earlier notion of critiquing metaphysics was not meant to deny that kind of objective ontological, the objective ontological bearing of what we're talking about. Yeah.
Thanks. I hope that at some point process and radical theology might come together rather more than they seem to have so far.
Yeah, but they do in the work of Catherine Keller in particular. She's literate in both traditions.
Great. Thanks, Jack. And over to you, Ken.
Thanks. Yeah, first, thanks to Peter and Barry for allowing me to actually understand the conversation that's having today, and that I can actually form a question. So kind of both questions kind of combined together, but I loved it when John said, he said, the radical openness of what I cannot see coming. For me, that really kind of struck a chord and kind of relates to almost like the subjectivity of existence. But Pete has been recently talking about the void. And so my question is, are we talking about, or one way of looking at this, are we talking about our relationship to the experience of the void and what we decide on how to manage our experience to the void? And so is radical, so part two is like, is radical theology, does that just allow one to become aware that we actually have a different way to look at this and to decide on that relationship?
Yeah, is there a substantive difference, Jack, do you think, between the idea of what you were saying, Ken, is openness to the future, an openness to a future that we do not know, and the idea of a confrontation with a question that is in the other? It feels like there's a slightly different texture or kind of theoretical frame there. And when you're talking about the void, I'm thinking of, like, primarily I would describe it as my encounter with unknowing is less an eschatological openness to a Messiah who is to come, but rather almost it's a confrontation with a question that is already here, and that I am woven into. In fact, I become a subject precisely kind of, well, in trying to answer the question through fantasy of what I am for the other. So I don't know if those are two slightly different approaches to this notion of mystery and whether that's significant.
Yeah, I mean, I tend not to say the void, but the open. And it certainly is, it's the coming of what I can't see coming. It's also the recalling of what I can't recall. I mean, it's also a structure of mourning and memory, as well as hope and expectation. And it's certainly an encounter with the mystery, which we are at this very moment. The mystery of the other person, the mystery of not just the other person, but other living things, of the planet that we're destroying, of the mystery of the universe, that in which we live and move and have our being. So, and I look upon that as a spur, as a impetus that moves life, that sets me in motion. It's generative. It's generative.
Hmm.
I mean, I think you said at one point, Pete, I wrote down, I have to check my notes, the lack is generative. I think you might have said that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would say so. Like,
And
I
that
mean, yeah.
that would be a way to bring together what the way I think about desire and what Pete's calling the lack. Lack is generative, but it's joyous.
Yes. Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
joyous. Enjoying dissatisfaction seems to me a kind of grim way to put the adventure of existence.
Yes.
The adventure of existence is exhilarating. It's uplifting. Unless you're depressed, and then you need to talk to somebody.
Yeah.
But so enjoying dissatisfaction seems to be a perverse way to put something which belongs to the very joy of life, the joie de vivre,
The
the
reason why
joy
I
of
like it,
adventure or adventure.
yeah. But here's the reason why I quite like that language. See what you think is, if I say, like, if in psychoanalytic theory generally there's an idea that we are always enjoying our dissatisfaction. So in psychoanalysis, if you go and you say, I'm really unhappy, I keep going out with the same type of person and they always betray me or whatever, and the analyst kind of says, well, what are you getting out of this? Right? Like that often there's an enjoyment. Now it's an enjoyment that you're not enjoying. But in psychoanalysis, if you go with this idea that enjoyment is always at work, the problem is we don't enjoy our enjoyment, then what I'm basically saying is we always, in a sense, get something out of dissatisfaction, whether we know it or not, usually in a bad way. The shoplifter, the gambler, the whatever is getting something out of this. And so what we want to do is find a way in which we can enjoy our enjoyment and then turn this into something productive. So that's why I kind of talk about kind of enjoying our dissatisfaction, only because I think we always are. And I think often in a bad way. Like often the person goes into psychoanalysis precisely because without knowing it, unconsciously, they're getting something out of their own suffering. And they have to almost be confronted with the jouissance. So, for a basic neurotic, they have to confront the jouissance that they're unconsciously getting from certain activities. Like they always think there's somebody outside trying to break into their house late at night, and kind of find out what jouissance that's giving, not so as they can enjoy, but so as in a way that kind of dissipates the negative dimension of it. Anyway, that's just kind of one of the reasons why is I think we're always enjoying our dissatisfaction, but mostly in bad ways.
I think you're both licking from different sides of the same pond, actually, but that's just me from the same gaping void. Anyway, Bill, you get the last live question.
Or Kate, I think it's Kate.
Sorry, it's me, actually.
Okay. Hey, Kate. Sorry.
I just wanted to go back 1 second to when Jack was talking about moving from within Christianity and moving from within religion and taking radical theology as a position from within. I know that Pete quite likes having his separate Church of the Contradiction and having liturgy that has the lack built into it and theopoetics and all of those kinds of things. But Jack, I was wondering what you thought that would look like, because quite often the church requires, or people within the church require you to adhere to the whole Nicene Creed. And unless you believe that God is a super being in the sky somewhere and Jesus came to earth and is God's son, then you're not acceptable. And it feels a bit like trying to put new wine in old wineskins. So how do you think?
Well, that's what I've been trying to undo since I got into the radical theology business, right? I wrote a book called What Would Jesus Deconstruct? And when I sent the book in, the Baker Press said to me, okay, this is very nice, but would you please give us a couple of examples of what you mean? So I said, okay, I'll give you 2 examples. They're both going to be Irish. One was icon. It was what Pete was doing, the experimental liturgies that Pete was creating, which is exactly a way to implement a tradition held deconstructively. Okay. The other was a Roman Catholic priest in Philadelphia whose punishment for disobeying his superiors in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia was to be sent to a black parish in the poorest, most desperately poor and dangerous neighborhood in Philadelphia, which he turned into a ministry of prophetic justice. In defiance, the church wanted the Catholic Church in Philadelphia wanted to close the place down because he wasn't generating any vocations and it wasn't bringing any income. And he kept defying them. So he said, "Do it, try it. I'll be on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer tomorrow morning if you do it. Try it. I dare you." So he resolutely, prophetically resisted from within the powers that be. Now he, by the way, is a absolutely Orthodox Catholic priest. Trinity, incarnation, the whole thing. So that's why one of the things I wanted to say, if we had more time, I think I might have said it first. When we talk about radical theology, radical theology is ultimately of theopraxis. It's theopoetics, but it's theopraxis, and it actually can be carried out within the boundaries of a completely or theoretically, doctrinally orthodox position. Martin Luther King was, as far as I know, a completely Orthodox Christian. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was an Orthodox Christian. Bishop Tutu was an Orthodox Christian. Father McNamee in St. Malachy's Parish in North Philadelphia is an Orthodox Catholic priest. But it translates into radical prophetic action. That's operating from within. That, I think, actually does more good than us.
But that's very good. But that's for me is a way for us to try to kind of go like, when really good action in terms of justice and looking out for the poor and helping the planet is happening, that's radical. But I go like, but for me, that's not radical, and it's not. That's really good. But what makes it radical? What makes something radical is well, for me, absence. I mean, that's how it's a way of this haunting, this kind of whatever. So I wouldn't want to claim that, if someone's serving the poor, that's radical theology. Like, I think that some radical theologians can be assholes. I am, I don't do very much, but radical theology is something about absence. And in terms of your two examples from that book, I was interested because that for me is a good example. One is within the church, but one was outside of, like,
exactly.
Yeah. So Icon was an attempt to try to create something new. And that's almost what I'm saying radical theology does. It does both. It keeps the tradition open and radical creativity.
It wasn't a new Hinduism. It was a new radical version of inherited tradition.
Yes, that's true. Although what I'm trying to do now
That's
is
what I mean.
even more far out. Yeah.
That's a complex, long talk. Should add that to the list. All right. This is from Anbar, who's actually in India and on with us, but his connections are sometimes dodgy.
Okay, I am going to have to run pretty soon. So this
is
the last question.
It's the very last question. So, how do we account for being without the presence of a God with stakes in the question of why is there something instead of nothing?
You mean, how can we account for being if nobody created being?
I think that seems, well, you can answer that. That's what
it means. Well, I mean, you would then attribute the same necessity to the world, to the universe, as you would to God, because at some point you're going to say something's necessary. It's this question: what is it you want to say is necessary? Say, well, the world had to come somewhere. Well, where did God come from? Oh, no, God didn't have to come from somewhere because God's a necessary principle of necessity. And so, well, you could just simply say, well, principle of necessity for me is not God; it's the world. Schelling said, Hegel said, God is the unconditional, but the unconditional, not God. Right? I mean, there are a lot of different names for the unconditional, and whatever attributes you would attribute to a creator God, you just simply attribute to the universe itself. You don't have to keep asking for where that came from.
Yeah, and then I'd add to that, because that's true. Like, you know, one might say mathematics is necessary when we say, you know, the universe is necessary, whatever, quantum oscillations. And then the other thing is, is whether nothing is a philosophical abstraction, that nothing is full. Like the physics kind of idea is actually nothing itself is divided, that there's something about this metaphysical question, why is there something rather than nothing, but that nothing itself is riven, and that's the kind of the fundamental dimension of reality. But yeah, they're all very speculative. I don't know if that's what the person was asking or not, but
well, we'll leave it with the speculative.
Yeah.